framed me. They fired me. And that's how they effed themselves into a divorce, a prison sentence, and a handful of deportations. I used to work at an upscale restaurant owned by a large corporate entity that owns several different restaurant brands. I worked there for about 3.5 years before they eventually fired me, but more about that later. First, I want to give an idea of my role there. My role at that job was a little of everything. Since the day I started working there, I took it upon myself to learn as much as possible. I was very persistent with management when I wanted to learn a new department. I had started as a server, but eventually had worked my way into different departments and job titles, like carryout, hosting, bartending, bar backing, banquets, catering, and deliveries. My singular goal while working there was to make myself available for as many hours as possible. I was being paid about $12 an hour, though that fluctuated if I was working as a bartender or server and making tips. Eventually, it was noticed by management how I fit best into one of the non-tipped positions. I was so good at it that they decided to try me out as an unofficial supervisor over the team that worked in carryout, catering, and deliveries, as those were all one department. I knew this was going to ultimately mean a few less hours since I would only be working one department, so I negotiated with management to increase my pay by about $1.50. Since I was taking on additional responsibilities, they were satisfied with the pay increase. I wasn't trying to get as much money as possible, I just wanted to be able to pay my bills and still have a little money left over for fun. I was living in the highly taxed city of Chicago, which is in the already highly taxed state of Illinois, so it was pretty difficult to make ends meet and still have money left to enjoy my life. I am a person of simple pleasures and I can enjoy things for long periods of time, so it didn't take much money to be happy. A video game could hold my attention for several months, sometimes even years. I had a family pet that I had brought with me to Chicago, so that counted as an extra expense. Not long after I started this position as the unofficial supervisor, I got a girlfriend, so I was also going out more often and spending money on her. With my position and some smart budgeting, I was able to afford all of this. The money wasn't an issue, but management had a high turnover rate, so the incoming managers often did not know what the department entailed or how important hours were to workers of these departments. Eventually, it was noted that our current general manager was going to be fired and replaced. The incoming general manager was supposed to be some rock star when it came to improving restaurants. We looked up his name and found him as the first search result on Google, but the entry wasn't some glowing review of his work ethic or of his impeccable ability to improve the way a restaurant runs. It was actually a mugshot and a police report filed for repeated domestic abuse. This is important later. We'll call him Harvey. Shortly after Harvey came in and started making changes, one of our best managers gave her resignation. She refused to work with him, and like a effing oracle, told us to expect lots of harassment, misogynistic comments, and for him to eventually run this place into the ground. Not long after she left, our general manager began replacing our current managers with hand-picked people that he had worked with in the past. Eventually all but one manager was replaced. That manager was the kitchen manager. We will call him Frito. Frito had been there since I had started working there. He seemed to be something of a chameleon, as in his values and ethics seemed to change depending on who his boss was. Honestly, I sort of applaud his survival instincts, but ultimately see him as a suck-up and traitor. Harvey never really replaced the manager for our department, so we ran without a lot of oversight. Unless you count me as the supervisor, we didn't constantly have someone breathing down our necks about how things should be done. Our department had some hiccups here and there, but it still ran really smoothly. Since we did not have our own manager, we often had to radio for a manager to come help us out on things that needed a manager card for approval. Frito would always be the one to answer these calls since the kitchen was closest to our department. Over time the new team of managers started to see Frito as the manager of our department as well. However, the hourly team that worked there still saw me as their supervisor. This meant that any time Frito was trying to make changes that would ultimately hurt us, the team relied on me to mitigate those disasters or to negotiate with Frito to let us do our jobs the way we had already proven worked really well. Over several months Frito and I would butt heads dozens of times. He and I were constantly arguing about how important hours were to the workers in this department. He had it in his head that we should be living off of tips like servers, but since most of our orders were carryout, they came in through Grubhub, and Grubhub doesn't tip. We didn't have a lot of deliveries in a day, and the tips we got from those were maybe $10 if we were lucky. But splitting $10 four ways doesn't add up to a lot. It just showed that Frito had no clue what he was talking about. Eventually we had a meeting with our Harvey, Frito, and all the workers of this department. It was marketed as a chance to voice all our grievances and concerns with the changes they wanted to make with no chance of retaliation. So the workers did exactly that. They talked about how Frito was trying to cut hours even though he isn't our actual manager. When it was brought up that they were attempting to hire someone to be the manager, the team suggested that I take over since I had already been supervising them and running things smoothly for the last several months. I was also the one that management consulted with when writing schedules, as I had an understanding of the days some workers could and couldn't work depending on their school schedules or family life. I could see at the moment it was suggested that Harvey and Frito made the decision on the spot that I had to be gotten rid of. Although they didn't say it, I could see the look they gave each other, and instinctively knew that my days at this place were numbered and my job was going to be getting the axe one way or another. They made a bunch of promises to us about not cutting hours. They told us that they would stop sending all but one person home early and only leaving one person to clean everything and close up by themselves, as this wasn't a small department and it was simply too much for one person to do alone while still meeting health and safety standards. They promised that whatever hours we were scheduled for, we would work. We weren't trying to be unreasonable, so we told them that we usually have 3 or 4 people scheduled to work our department. They could cut 2 of them early, but we always needed at least 2 people here to help close properly. The promise was made that they would always have at least 2 closers. However, only about a week later, they started sending all but one person home early again every night. One night they tried to do it while I was scheduled as the closer, and we had just returned from a massive catering event and there was an unbelievable amount of cleanup left to do for one person. When Frito came in and tried to send everyone except me home, I stepped up and told him that he was consistently breaking the promise he had made it to us during the meeting. He looked me square in the face and told me to stop complaining about it, and if I was going to keep trying to talk to him about him breaking his promises, he could easily find someone who could work my shifts. I quickly realized that this was an assassination attempt on my job. He wanted me to press it further, so I backed off and started cleaning. I ended up having to stay way late, and that meant overtime pay anyway. I got a write-up for that, since we aren't allowed to work overtime without a manager's approval. When I refused to sign the write-up, pointing out that I had tried to explain to Frito that I wouldn't be able to clean up all that stuff alone before my scheduled shift ended, I was allowed to leave without signing the write-up, but only because the HR rep that was present at the time wasn't one of Harvey's cronies. Skip ahead to the day I was fired. It is important to note at this point that I always came into work an hour early. Since we lived in Chicago, food was expensive. However, at our job we were allowed to have as much free soup and bread as we liked. So I would come into work 1 hour early every day so I could have some soup and bread for lunch before my shift. But on this day, when I walked into the kitchen to get myself some soup, one of the line cooks told me that he had a dish that had been canceled after he cooked it, and Frito had told him to give it to someone. He assured me Frito had already comped it and that it was free to take for whoever wanted it. It just so happened to be my favorite appetizer, so I happily took the free food. Not long after I got to my booth, both Harvey and Frito approached me and asked me if I had put in a ticket for that food. I told them that the line cook had given it to me and said it was the canceled order that Frito had already comped. Frito looked dumbfounded and said he had no idea what I was talking about. So Harvey told me, "I think you know that's theft. Go ahead and finish the food and then grab my stuff and go. That's the last meal you'll be having here."